The airport pulsed with noise, voices rising, heels clicking, announcements crackling through the air like static. And then everything stopped. A cane struck the floor, a silence fell. In the middle of the terminal, a flight attendant stood over an elderly woman, her boarding pass on the ground, her dignity bruised. "First-class boarding isn't for people like you," the attendant snapped. But the woman didn't flinch. She bent down, picked up her cane, straightened her back, and looked her square in the eyes. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your career." She wasn't just any passenger. She was Meredith Winslow, the woman who built the airline from the ground up. And now everyone was watching. This is not a story about a slap. It's about what happens when quiet power meets blind arrogance, and the reckoning that follows. Will one apology be enough? Or is redemption something you have to earn, one painful truth at a time? The airport pulsed with chaos. Passengers darted in every direction, announcements crackling over the loudspeakers like bursts of static. It was a storm of motion and noise. And then, all at once, everything stopped. Crack. The sharp sound tore through the terminal like a gunshot. Gasps rose from the crowd as an elderly woman's cane was struck from her trembling hand. It skittered across the polished tile floor with a loud echoing clatter. Frozen in shock, the woman instinctively raised a shaking hand to shield herself. Her pale blue eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto the figure standing rigidly before her. A flight attendant. Her name tag glinted under the fluorescent lights. Caroline Whitmore. Caroline's face was twisted with disdain, her voice cutting and loud enough for the entire terminal to hear. "I told you clearly. Move aside. First-class boarding isn't for people like you." A stunned silence fell like a heavy curtain. Travelers stood motionless, eyes darting between the flight attendant and the fragile woman she'd just humiliated. No one dared step forward. But the elderly woman, Meredith Winslow, did not flinch. She did not cry out. Her hand trembled slightly, but with quiet dignity, she slowly bent to retrieve her cane. She straightened with remarkable poise, her grace casting Caroline's aggression into stark relief. Then Meredith looked her in the eyes. Her expression wasn't angry. It was something far deeper, a still, steady calm that seemed to shake even the hardened attendant. And in a voice soft but unwavering, she said, "You've just made the gravest mistake of your career." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning, sending chills through everyone within earshot. Before we continue, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. A little earlier that day, the lounge had been a peaceful pocket of serenity, gentle clinks of porcelain cups, soft conversations, sunlight streaming through tall glass panes. In a quiet corner by the window sat Meredith Winslow. Her hands rested on the carved ivory handle of her elegant cane. She wore an understated emerald green dress, a delicate brooch gleaming just above her heart. Her silver hair was styled in soft, graceful waves. To most rushing travelers, she was simply another elderly woman waiting for her flight. But not to everyone. Nearby, a sharply dressed young man named Alexander Hartwell glanced up from his laptop, noticing Meredith's dignified presence. He instinctively stood and politely gestured toward his seat with a respectful nod. "Would you like my seat, ma'am?" he offered kindly. Meredith raised her eyes to meet his, offering a gentle, appreciative smile. "Thank you, young man, but I am quite comfortable." Alexander nodded respectfully, returning her smile warmly as he resumed his seat, unaware of the true identity and significance of the graceful woman seated just steps away from him. At the bustling check-in counter, flight attendants moved briskly, their clipped voices efficiently directing passengers. Among them, Caroline Whitmore stood out, tall, severe, and self-assured. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back, accentuating sharp features that rarely softened. Caroline had long served the first-class cabin and wore her authority like an invisible crown, making snap judgments about who was worthy of her exclusive domain. Her eyes scanned the lounge swiftly, categorizing passengers. She acknowledged those who fit her ideal image, expensive suits, designer luggage, authoritative demeanors, while swiftly dismissing anyone who fell short of her standards. When her gaze briefly landed on Meredith, Caroline paused, her lip curling slightly in disdain before quickly moving on, barely registering the elderly woman's presence. Her attention returned sharply to the high-profile business executives she intended to serve attentively on this flight, completely unaware that Meredith Winslow was no ordinary traveler and certainly not someone whose dignity should ever be questioned. As the announcement for first-class boarding echoed through the terminal, Meredith Winslow calmly rose from her seat. She carefully adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and tightened her delicate grip on the polished ivory handle of her cane. She moved toward the boarding gate unhurriedly, each step deliberate and composed, as though time itself held no sway over her. Other passengers hurried around her, eager to settle into their seats, barely noticing her quiet dignity as they rushed forward. When Meredith reached the gate, she gracefully extended her boarding pass to the attendant stationed at the entrance, Caroline Whitmore. Caroline barely glanced at the ticket before abruptly lifting her hand, blocking Meredith with visible irritation. "Ma'am, this line is exclusively for first-class passengers," Caroline stated crisply, her tone superficially polite yet dripping with contempt. Meredith slowly raised her point, meeting Caroline's dismissive eyes directly. Her expression was calm yet unreadable. "I'm fully aware," she replied gently, her voice steady and composed. Caroline exhaled sharply, irritation deepening on her face as she studied the boarding pass more carefully. Her brow furrowed in disbelief, clearly skeptical that an elderly woman with such modest appearance could possibly hold a legitimate first-class ticket. "Are you absolutely sure this is your ticket?" Caroline asked condescendingly, tilting her head mockingly, clearly anticipating Meredith to admit some error or misunderstanding. Meredith, however, remained impeccably calm, showing no offense at the degrading question. "Yes, I am quite certain," she answered quietly, unwavering. Caroline pursed her lips impatiently, glancing behind Meredith as if expecting a caregiver or companion to step in and clarify the supposed misunderstanding. Yet no one came forward. Meredith was unmistakably traveling alone. Sighing exaggeratedly, Caroline shook her head dismissively, her voice now raised slightly, intentionally audible to those around. "Clearly there's been some kind of mistake," she said patronizingly, as if explaining a basic concept to a confused child. "First class is reserved for specific passengers," she continued, waving her hand dismissively toward the economy boarding gate. "You belong over there." Meredith stood motionless, her serene gaze never wavering, undisturbed by Caroline's increasingly disrespectful tone. After a deliberate pause, Meredith finally spoke again, her voice firm and authoritative. "There is no mistake. This is my seat." Caroline's jaw visibly tightened, anger flickering across her face. She'd encountered countless passengers before, those attempting to sneak into first class with fake tickets or illegitimate upgrades, and had absolutely no tolerance left. Frustrated, she held Meredith's ticket up against the overhead lights, scrutinizing it dramatically for signs of forgery. "I don't know how you managed to obtain this," Caroline muttered under her breath, her voice laced with suspicion and disgust. "But you won't be sitting here today." Behind Meredith, the boarding line grew tense as curious onlookers began exchanging uncomfortable glances. Alexander Hartwell, the young businessman who earlier offered Meredith his seat, tensed visibly, hesitating as though he wanted to intervene, but choosing silence. Caroline's patience snapped completely. Her voice became harsh and cutting, openly humiliating Meredith. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Step aside immediately." When Meredith remained resolute, not giving an inch, Caroline's composure broke entirely. With a sudden, shocking motion, she violently slapped the boarding pass out of Meredith's hand. The sharp sound pierced through the terminal like a whip crack, causing passengers to gasp audibly. Meredith's cane fell from her grip, hitting the polished floor with an echoing clatter. A stunned silence descended over the gate area. Abigail Mercer, a woman standing nearby, covered her mouth in horror. Sebastian's jaw tightened with anger, his eyes wide with disbelief, yet Caroline seemed utterly indifferent to their reactions. "I told you to move," she snapped coldly, her voice raised without an ounce of remorse. But Meredith, instead of recoiling or protesting, slowly bent down to retrieve her fallen cane. Her movements were graceful, measured, but powerful in their calm dignity. Rising once more to her full height, she met Caroline's glare directly, her clear eyes radiating a quiet, formidable strength that made the attendant instinctively step back. The tension hung thick between them, almost suffocating. Then Meredith spoke softly yet clearly, her calm voice sending an unmistakable chill through the air. You've just made the gravest mistake of your entire career. The silence grew heavier, stifling, almost tangible. Then she repeated herself, her voice now laced with something deeper, colder, chillingly composed. You've just made the gravest mistake of your life. Carolyn scoffed, an uneasy laugh escaping her throat, but her eyes shifted nervously beneath Meredith's unwavering stare. Ma'am, I don't have time for these theatrics, she said, voice tight with contempt. If you refuse to move, I'll have security escort you out immediately. The crowd around them stirred louder, discomfort rippling through the gathering passengers. Sebastian Drake clenched his jaw tightly, clearly wrestling with whether to intervene. Abigail Mercer, the woman who had gasped in horror moments earlier, scanned the surrounding faces, hoping someone would speak. But no one did. They simply watched, caught in the grip of the unfolding scene. Unfazed, Meredith stood her ground. Her composure was extraordinary, despite the humiliation she just endured. She calmly retrieved her cane, grasping it firmly with a dignity that only seemed to deepen Caroline's irritation. Her voice remained steady, poised, and firm, cutting through the tension. I have a first-class ticket, and I intend to board this flight in my rightful seat. Caroline drew a sharp, irritated breath through clenched teeth, shaking her head in disbelief. Unbelievable, she muttered bitterly under her breath. Without another word to Meredith, Caroline spun toward Leah Bennett, a younger flight attendant standing nearby. Leah, call security, now. Leah hesitated. Her eyes darted between Caroline and Meredith. Something about this felt deeply wrong. Meredith Winslow wasn't nervous. She radiated calm authority, and that made Leah pause. But Caroline's glare sharpened, forcing Leah's hand. She reached for the intercom. Before she could press it, a voice rang out, firm, unmistakable. That won't be necessary. Heads turned. A senior airline official strode forward, his movements swift, decisive. Richard Montgomery's tailored suit and clipped badge announced his authority before he even spoke. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were steel. He ignored Caroline entirely. Instead, he approached Meredith with a respectful incline of his head. Mrs. Winslow, he said quietly, my sincerest apologies for the delay. Your seat is ready. We're honored to have you aboard. Carolyn blinked, stunned. Wait, what? Now Richard turned to her. Step aside, Miss Whitmore. Silence fell like a curtain. Caroline's stomach lurched, her fingers clenched around the crumpled boarding pass. There must be some mistake, she stammered. There is no mistake. Richard cut her off, voice cold. Did you even check the system before humiliating her? Carolyn froze. She hadn't. She hadn't checked anything. Richard didn't wait for a reply. Leah, he said, escort Mrs. Winslow to her seat. Leah stepped forward, her tone now low and reverent. Right this way, ma'am. As Meredith passed, she gave Caroline one last glance. Not angry, just deeply disappointed. Passengers instinctively parted. Her cane tapped softly down the jet bridge, each step echoing with quiet authority. Caroline stood frozen. Her cheeks burned as whispers rose around her like smoke. Every glance felt like judgment. Richard stepped close, his voice low. When this plane takes off, he said, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation. Then he turned, leaving her standing alone. The terminal slowly came back to life, but the glances lingered. The judgment stayed. Inside the cabin, Leah guided Meredith gently to her seat. I'm so sorry for what happened, ma'am, she said. I should have stepped in. Meredith smiled kindly. It's quite all right, my dear. Sadly, I've met many like her. Leah hesitated, then asked softly, who exactly are you? Meredith's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. She said nothing, just leaned back into her seat, perfectly composed. That silence told Leah everything she needed to know. Meanwhile, Caroline stumbled toward the galley. Her limbs moved, but her mind spun. Why had Richard reacted that way? Who was Meredith Winslow? She barely lifted the paper cup before the intercom crackled. Miss Whitmore, report to the cockpit. Immediately. The cup crumpled in her hand. She'd never been summoned to the cockpit before takeoff. Her chest tightened. Her legs felt like lead. As she stepped forward, she already knew. This wasn't a procedure, it was a reckoning. Richard Montgomery stood to the side, arms crossed, silent but seething. His displeasure radiated like heat from a furnace. Stephen's voice was the first to break the silence, firm, deliberate, chillingly calm. Miss Whitmore, explain immediately why you publicly humiliated a passenger traveling in first class. Carolyn's mouth went dry. I, I didn't humiliate her, she stammered weakly. I simply thought there was an error with her boarding pass. Did you actually verify that supposed error? Stephen interrupted, voice sharpened, before denying her entry and assaulting her dignity. Caroline froze. Captain Reynolds exhaled heavily and rubbed his temples. Richard's voice sliced through the silence. Answer the question. Caroline's voice trembled with shame. No, I made an assumption. Stephen inhaled slowly, lowering his voice into something far more dangerous. Miss Whitmore, do you have any idea who you just insulted and publicly shamed? Caroline's fingers twitched. Her mind raced but found no footing. She was just an elderly passenger, she murmured. Stephen's gaze hardened. His words struck like ice. That woman was Meredith Winslow, the chairwoman and founder of this airline. The revelation hit like a punch to the chest. Caroline's breath caught, her knees weakened. Captain Reynolds stared ahead, his jaw tight. Richard Montgomery didn't hide his disappointment. Stephen continued, voice now heavy with the weight of her failure. You publicly humiliated the most powerful woman in this industry, a woman who built this airline from nothing. You did it in front of crew, staff, and passengers, none of whom will forget. Caroline's chest tightened painfully, her hands shook. She had slapped and shamed the airline's very founder. Stephen let the silence linger, long, suffocating, before landing the final blow. You have one chance, exactly one. You will return to Mrs. Winslow and issue a full, unequivocal public apology. You will personally ensure she receives flawless, exemplary service for the entire flight. Refuse or fail in any way, and your career ends the moment this plane lands. Her throat tightened. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Founder, chairwoman, the most influential woman in aviation. She forced herself to speak, her voice distant, nearly hollow. I didn't realize. You didn't realize what? Richard cut in, harshly. That she didn't fit your idea of what a first-class passenger should look like? Carolyn flinched, the words like a slap. That's not. Don't, Stephen snapped. Miss Whitmore, if you had recognized her name, if you'd had even a hint of who she truly was, would you have treated her that way? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't need to answer. Her silence confirmed what they already knew. Captain Reynolds turned away, disgust clear on his face. Richard's disappointment showed in every line of his expression. Stephen nodded once. Go. His voice was final. You will apologize publicly and escort Mrs. Winslow personally. This is not a request. It is your only opportunity to retain your position. Fail, and you will never wear this uniform again. Carolyn nodded stiffly, shame burning beneath her skin. Understood, she whispered. No one offered comfort. Not the captain, not Richard, not Stephen. Each step back to the cabin felt heavier than the last. As she entered the first-class section again, she felt every pair of eyes upon her. They didn't need to know every detail, but they certainly knew enough. The murmurs and whispers from the boarding gate had followed her onto the plane, and now Caroline could feel their weight pressing down on her like an inescapable spotlight. Every step she took toward Meredith Winslow felt like an agonizing march of shame. Meredith sat gracefully in her seat, entirely at ease, her cane placed neatly by her side. Leah Bennett lingered nearby, watching carefully, uncertain how the moment would unfold, sensing this was far from over. Carolyn stopped stiffly beside Meredith. Her hands were visibly trembling as she forced herself to speak the words she never imagined she would have to say. Mrs. Winslow, her voice cracked, betraying her profound discomfort. She swallowed and tried again. I must sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier. Meredith turned her head slowly. Her eyes met Caroline's anxious gaze with a serene expression that held unsettling intensity. There was something piercing behind her calm gaze, something still, yet razor-sharp. The silence stretched unbearably between them. Passengers nearby subtly leaned in, curiosity rising like a tide. Even Leah held her breath. Caroline felt a fresh wave of humiliation burn through her. She had belittled this woman, dismissed her without hesitation, and now she stood before her, diminished. She forced herself to continue, her voice shaking. I misjudged you. My actions were wrong. I showed you disrespect in front of everyone here. Meredith didn't respond immediately. She allowed the words to settle, let them linger in the air, weighted and unrelenting. Only after that deliberate pause did she nod. I accept your apology, she said quietly. Caroline exhaled, a flicker of relief crossing her face, believing the ordeal was over. But then Meredith calmly lifted her glass of water, took a delicate sip, and added with chilling clarity, now, please repeat that apology. For them. The air inside the cabin shifted. Cold, dense, heavy. Caroline blinked. Repeat it. For who? Meredith gestured toward the rows of passengers. For all those who witnessed your behavior, who heard you demean and humiliate an elderly woman, who saw you slap the hand of the very person who built this airline from the ground up. Her voice was calm, measured, yet the impact of her words was thunderous. I've accepted your apology personally, she continued, but they deserve to hear it too. Carolyn felt the blood drain from her face. A chill ran down her spine. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. Around her, every passenger's gaze was fixed, waiting. The soft hum of the aircraft was drowned out by a silence thick with judgment. Apologizing privately had been mortifying, but publicly, to admit her arrogance, her prejudice, her error in front of a cabin full of witnesses? It felt unbearable. Anger flickered within her for a moment. Why hadn't anyone stepped forward earlier? Why now? Why this theater? But then she remembered Richard Montgomery's words, his warning, the consequence. Her career hung in the balance. Carolyn clenched her fists at her sides, then slowly released them. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to lift her head. Richard was watching from the front of the cabin, his arms crossed, stern, unforgiving. This humiliation, she had earned it. Drawing a ragged breath, Caroline raised her voice. I owe an apology to every passenger here. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin, attention sharpened. Sebastian Drake, the businessman who had earlier nearly intervened, raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Abigail Mercer leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Caroline with quiet intensity. Caroline continued. Her voice trembled, but she pushed through, each word a painful step toward redemption. Before boarding, I made an unjustified assumption about a passenger. My actions toward Mrs. Winslow were disrespectful and completely inappropriate. I questioned her right to sit in first class without any valid reason, and I humiliated her publicly. Murmurs deepened. A mix of recognition and shock stirred through the seats. Caroline forced herself to finish. My behavior was unprofessional, unfair, and utterly unacceptable. For this, I sincerely apologize. The silence that followed was suffocating. No applause, no reassurances, just the weight of consequence hanging in the air. And then, Meredith spoke. Thank you for your apology, Miss Whitmore, but I want you to understand something clearly. Carolyn turned back toward her, a pit growing in her stomach. Meredith leaned forward, eyes sharp and unwavering. If I had been just another elderly passenger, if I had held no position, no status, would you be standing here right now apologizing in front of all these people? The question landed like a strike to the chest. Carolyn froze, her face draining of color. They all knew the answer, and so did she. Had Meredith Winslow not been who she was, Caroline would never have been held accountable. Her behavior would have gone unchallenged, unapologized. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others stared, waiting. Caroline lowered her eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. No, I wouldn't. Meredith studied her, and after a long, deliberate pause, she nodded, then leaned back. Caroline turned, her stomach twisted into knots, ready to escape this unbearable spotlight, when a voice stopped her cold. Miss Whitmore. It was Richard Montgomery, and he hadn't finished with her yet. He said sternly, his voice neutral, yet carrying unmistakable weight, you will personally attend to Mrs. Winslow's needs for the remainder of this flight. Caroline froze, her eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a public declaration, a silent broadcast of Meredith Winslow's rightful authority. For the rest of the flight, Caroline Whitmore would serve as a living consequence, a reminder, not just to herself but to every passenger watching. Meredith, ever composed, picked up her glass of water and leaned back. Serene, regal. Her presence alone now carried the power of 1,000 reprimands. Instead of retreating to the galley to hide from the judgmental eyes of the cabin, Caroline would remain in full view, personally attending to the very woman she had publicly shamed. Meredith turned a page in her book, unbothered, her calm a quiet assertion that this was far from over. Caroline's entire body tensed under the weight of Richard Montgomery's command. A part of her burned with resistance, wanted to protest, to suggest any other attendant for the task. But she knew she couldn't afford a single misstep more. The silence in the Cheyenne was no longer filled with murmurs. It was heavier now, denser, waiting. Beside her, Leah Bennett hesitated, unsure whether to offer help. But Richard's steady, unflinching stare made it clear. There would be no negotiations. Caroline inhaled sharply, turned stiffly toward Meredith, and clasped her hands tightly in front of her. "If there's anything you require during the flight, Mrs. Winslow," she began, her voice tight and barely audible, "please do not hesitate to ask." Meredith didn't look up at first. She deliberately finished her sentence, letting the moment stretch long and painfully uncomfortable. Only then did she raise her gaze. There was no smugness in her eyes, no anger, only calm, dignified authority. "I'll keep that in mind," she said simply, then returned to her novel. Carolyn flushed. The dismissal was subtle but absolute. She turned to the front of the cabin, still in full view, unable to escape the silent weight of every passenger's stare. Richard gave her one final glance before turning toward the cockpit, his message delivered. Leah lingered, glancing at Caroline with something, maybe pity, maybe uncertainty. "I can help if you need anything," she whispered gently. Caroline tightened her jaw, pride still raw. "I can handle it," she muttered. Leah nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. With one last look toward Meredith, she stepped away, leaving Caroline alone and exposed. She could feel every eye behind every flickering screen, every magazine. Passengers who pretended not to stare, but didn't look away. Sebastian Drake, seated not far, watched openly now. His fingers tapped rhythmically against his armrest, his expression unreadable. Curious, observant. Not mocking, but not sympathetic either. Carolyn stood tall, or at least tried to. Inside, she felt small, shrunken. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her like a second uniform. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, performing her duties as if nothing had happened. Yet every pass by Meredith's seat scraped her nerves raw. Meredith didn't speak. She didn't glare. She simply existed, calmly reading, sipping water, glancing quietly out the window. And occasionally, when Caroline drew near, Meredith's eyes would lift. Just for a moment, not with anger, not even judgment, just silent, powerful observation. It was worse than rage. At one point, Caroline approached with a tray of refreshments. Her steps faltered. She hesitated. Should she speak? Place the glass silently? Meredith looked up, her gaze meeting Caroline's with that same quiet grace. I brought you some fresh water," Caroline said, her voice weak. Meredith nodded subtly, resting her book on her lap. "Thank you," she said softly but firmly. Caroline's hand trembled as she set the glass on the tray table. It wobbled, sloshing a thin line of water across the surface before settling with a quiet clink. She quickly withdrew her hand, burning with shame at the rare moment of clumsiness. She never fumbled. Not until now. Meredith spoke again, gently. "You've been employed by this airline a long time, haven't you, Miss Whitmore?" Caroline stiffened. "Yes," she said, wary. Meredith nodded thoughtfully. "Then you, of all people, should understand the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect." The words landed like stones, softly spoken yet devastating. Caroline's chest tightened, her throat constricted. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was truth. And Meredith wasn't finished. "In all that time," she continued, "has anyone ever questioned whether you truly belonged here?" Caroline's heart dropped. She knew what Meredith meant. Had anyone ever doubted her competence? Her worth? Had anyone made her feel like she didn't belong? No, she had always moved through the cabin with confidence. No one had looked at her the way she had looked at Meredith. No one had made her feel small. Yet that's exactly what she had done. Carolyn's lips parted, but no words came out. Her instincts screamed for defense, to explain, to shift blame, but it would be a lie. And for the first time in her career, Caroline Whitmore had nothing to say. Meredith didn't press. She simply lifted her glass, took a sip, and returned to her book. The moment lingered, soft but cuttingly clear. Carolyn turned to walk away, but shame clung to her like a shadow. Not the kind born from embarrassment. No, this was deeper, heavier. This was the shame that comes when a mirror is held up, and you don't like what you see. She moved through this first-class cabin, invisible but watched, and for the first time, truly seen. She had spent her career commanding respect, enforcing order, ensuring flights ran flawlessly. But now she was the one being taught a painful lesson. Carolyn tried desperately to distract herself, pouring drinks, straightening trays, offering strained mechanical smiles. Yet her mind kept circling back to Meredith's words, looping over and over like an unresolved echo. Has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here? She already knew the answer, and it sickened her. At the front of the plane, Richard Montgomery stood near the galley, arms folded, watching Caroline through narrowed eyes. His gaze tracked every falter, every hesitation. "You're struggling," he remarked quietly as she approached. Caroline stiffened. "I'm fine," she muttered, grabbing a tray of refreshments a bit too hastily. Richard sighed, shaking his head. "No, you're not." She clenched her jaw, but said nothing. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You've been doing this a long time, Whitmore. Long enough to know better than to behave the way you did today." Carolyn's shoulders tensed. "But," she began, already defensive. "It wasn't about protocol," Richard continued, his tone even but unyielding. "It was about what you believed a first-class passenger should look like." Her fingers curled against the edge of the galley counter, knuckles white. "I didn't mean, it doesn't matter what you meant." He cut her off, voice suddenly sharper. "It matters what you did." Carolyn flinched but kept her stance, her voice tight. "I already apologized." Richard studied her, eyes probing. Then, after a long pause, he nodded slightly. "Yes, you did. But do you understand what you're apologizing for?" Caroline's breath caught. She wanted to say yes, that she understood perfectly. But deep down, she knew what he meant. He wasn't asking if she regretted the slap or the humiliation. He was asking if she understood the bias that led to it. Unable or unwilling to answer, she turned away and began fidgeting with napkins that didn't need straightening. "I need to get back to work," she said stiffly. Richard didn't stop her. He simply stepped insolent, his final words hanging in the air. "Then get back to work." As Caroline moved through the cabin, his voice echoed relentlessly in her mind. Meals were served, drinks distributed. But the atmosphere had changed. She was no longer the calm, commanding presence of before. She was a symbol now, a walking cautionary tale. Passengers who had witnessed everything watched her differently, curious, contemplative, cold. Sebastian Drake, seated a few rows back, caught her eye as she passed. "Quite the day, isn't it?" he said casually, swirling his drink. Caroline forced a brittle smile. "Just another flight," she replied, voice forced, too light. Sebastian gave her a knowing look. Then he nodded toward Meredith Winslow, serene, reading, untouched. He turned back to Caroline, his voice lowered, thoughtful, edged with something sharp. "I fly first class regularly. I've seen attendants like you. Strict, efficient, no tolerance for nonsense. Usually I respect that." Her brow twitched, already bracing for the sting. "Usually, but sir," he repeated, sipping his drink slowly. "But today I saw someone decide they had the right to judge who belonged and who didn't." He let that hang. "That's not respect. That's bias." Caroline's chest tightened. His words landed like a slap. She wanted to walk away, to deflect, to dismiss him. But she couldn't, because he was right. Sebastian said no more. He simply turned back to his drink. Conversation over. Caroline turned stiffly down the aisle, the pressure in her chest nearly unbearable. She'd built a career on consistency, fairness, professionalism. But today, she'd twisted those values into weapons, justifications, excuses. Now, every whispered word, every sidelong glance from the passengers around her felt like judgment, deserved, inescapable. She had judged Meredith before the woman even spoke, had assumed without hesitation that she didn't belong, that she couldn't belong. And had Richard not intervened, had Meredith not been who she was, her cruelty would have gone unchallenged. The realization punched through her like ice. A crackle from the intercom jolted her from thought. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. Carolyn straightened instinctively. Muscle memory took over. Seatbelts, trays, final checks. She moved efficiently like she always had. But her mind was still back at gate 17, still standing over Meredith Winslow, still slapping a boarding pass from a hand that never trembled in fear, but held centuries of quiet, relentless power. And for the first time, Carolyn didn't just feel humiliated. She felt ashamed. She had made a disastrous judgment, a decision she had never once second-guessed until now. Caroline reached Meredith Winslow's seat last. The elderly woman sat poised, her seatbelt already fastened, quietly watching the city emerge through the window below. For a long moment, Caroline stood there unsure of what to say or if she should say anything at all. Before she could decide, Meredith spoke softly without turning her head. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Caroline tensed slightly. Thinking about what? Meredith turned to face her at last, her eyes unreadable but undeniably compelling. "About why you did it." Carolyn opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Meredith was right. She had been questioning herself ever since she left the cockpit, ever since she stood in front of Meredith and admitted her wrongs. And now, standing here, all excuses vanished. For the first time, she saw herself clearly. The plane jolted gently as the landing gear descended. The cabin felt still. Too still. Heavy with truths no one had voiced, Caroline exhaled shakily. I don't know why I did it," she admitted. Her voice wasn't defensive, it was raw, honest. Meredith studied her, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it's time you find out." Caroline swallowed hard. There was no way to undo what she had done, no redemption guaranteed, but that sentence, those few quiet words, made something shift inside her. This wasn't over when the wheels touched down. The wheels touched down with a smooth but firm landing. A gentle murmur stirred through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked. A calm voice filled the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off." The familiar announcement washed over Caroline like noise from a past life. Passengers moved automatically, stretching, retrieving bags. But Caroline felt no relief, no satisfaction, just dread. At the front of the first-class cabin, Richard Montgomery stood by the galley, speaking quietly into the in-flight phone. His posture rigid, his tone clipped. This wasn't routine. This was coordination. Meredith remained calm, serene as she gathered her belongings, her movements graceful, unhurried. She reached for her handbag and cane, her eyes briefly flickering toward Caroline. The glance was brief but heavy with meaning. Caroline forced herself to stand tall. She had apologized. She had served. But somehow, it still didn't feel finished. The seatbelt sign dinged off. First-class passengers moved with their usual calm, collecting bags and coats. Sebastian Drake rose smoothly from his seat, adjusted his jacket, and gave Caroline a look. "Well," he murmured, voice low but pointed. This was certainly memorable. Caroline said nothing. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "You'll remember today for a long time, I imagine." She said nothing, but inside something twisted sharply. He was right. He turned and stepped into the jet bridge, leaving her behind. Taking a deep breath, Caroline turned toward Meredith Winslow. Meredith was calmly adjusting her handbag, cane resting lightly in her hand. Her composure hadn't wavered once. Not from the beginning. Her gaze found Caroline's again. Steady, unblinking, as if searching for something still unanswered. Then Meredith spoke. "Walk with me." Caroline blinked. "Excuse me?" Meredith nodded toward the open jet bridge. "Walk with me," she repeated. There was no force in her tone, but it was not a request. Caroline's instincts screamed to stay behind, to hide. But Richard Montgomery's voice cut through the hesitation. "Go!" Carolyn looked toward him. His expression was resolute, uncompromising. She exhaled sharply, jaw tight, and gave a small nod. As Meredith rose from her seat with effortless grace, Caroline fell into step behind her. It felt like walking toward her own judgment. The jet bridge stretched like a tunnel, every echoing step magnified by her anxiety. And when they stepped into the bustling terminal, Caroline immediately felt it. Something had shifted. Travelers moved in every direction, voices and footsteps blurring into the usual airport rhythm. But for Caroline, everything slowed. Meredith walked slowly but purposefully, her cane tapping lightly on the tile floor. People instinctively stepped aside, not because of her age, but because of her presence, the quiet kind of authority that didn't need volume or display. Carolyn walked beside her in silence, every step weighted. Then her heart stopped. Ahead, a group of airline executives had gathered by a restricted gate. In their center stood Stephen Caldwell, the airline's top executive. His presence was unmistakable. Impeccable suit, unreadable expression, cold authority radiating from every movement. And beside him, airport security. Caroline's breath caught. Meredith didn't slow. She approached without hesitation. Carolyn followed, dread twisting her stomach. Stephen stepped forward. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, nodding respectfully, "I trust your flight was enlightening." Meredith offered a small, knowing smile. "Oh, indeed it was." Stephen's eyes flicked to Caroline. "Miss Whitmore, we need to speak with you." Caroline's fingers trembled. Sir, Not here," Stephen said sharply. "Come with us." Her chest clenched, and then Meredith stepped forward. "Miss Whitmore understands the gravity of her actions," she said, her voice level. "I'm confident she is prepared to fully accept responsibility. Isn't that right, Miss Whitmore?" Carolyn's throat closed. She had told herself the apology was enough, that serving humbly through the flight was enough. But now she knew better. This wasn't penance. This was reckoning. She glanced at the executives, at the security officers, and finally at Meredith. Calm, still, waiting not with rage, not with triumph, but with expectation. A mirror held up to her soul. And Caroline Whitmore had no idea what would come next, but for the first time she didn't look away. Caroline understood. This was it. Meredith intended her to face the full consequences of her actions. And now there was nowhere left to hide. "Miss Whitmore," Stephen said again, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "Please come with us." For the first time in her distinguished career, Caroline hesitated. She had always been the one in charge, commanding, directing, unshakable. But now she stood on the receiving end of scrutiny, the one being led, being judged, being asked to explain herself. She felt exposed, small, vulnerable. Still, she forced her legs to move. Each step behind Stephen and the two security officers felt heavy, reluctant. The hallway toward the executive offices felt disturbingly like the march toward an arrest. Technically, it wasn't, but the weight was the same. Travelers in the terminal glanced toward her. Some stared, others quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. But she could feel their eyes, their whispers. Judgment was a current she could no longer escape. They reached a set of sleek glass doors, the airline's emblem gleaming proudly at their center. Behind those doors waited her future. Stephen swiped his badge. The doors clicked open. He gestured for her to enter. Caroline paused just for a moment. She turned her head. Meredith Winslow sat composed in the lounge area just outside, her expression calm, her posture still, her gaze watching. There was no anger in it, no pity, only something firm, measured. A quiet demand that Caroline meet this moment with honesty. Caroline didn't know if it was empathy or a test. She turned away, stepped through the threshold, and the doors closed behind her with a final, deliberate click. Inside, the conference room felt cold, not in temperature but in tone. The long, polished table gleamed under the glare of overhead lights. At its head sat James Whitmore, the airline's senior operations manager. His sharp gaze locked onto her instantly. Two other executives flanked him, thick folders laid out in front of them, undoubtedly documenting every detail of her failure. Carolyn's stomach turned. "Sit," James said simply, gesturing to a chair across from him. Carolyn obeyed, lowering herself stiffly, her spine held straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The security officers stood by the door, still and silent. James leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "You know exactly why you're here." Carolyn nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then please," he continued evenly, "explain exactly what happened on this flight." Her instincts itched to defend herself, to say she'd been following protocol, protecting order, doing her job, but those were masks, hollow, empty. Drawing a breath, Caroline chose honesty. "I made an unjust assumption about a passenger," she said quietly. "Because of that assumption, I treated her unfairly." James didn't react. He simply watched her, waited. "I publicly humiliated her," Carolyn continued, her voice straining. "And when she resisted, I put my hands on her." James leaned back slightly. His face gave nothing away. "Do you fully comprehend what you've just admitted to, Miss Whitmore?" Carolyn's fingers tightened against her lap. "Yes, sir." The executives exchanged looks, surprised perhaps by the starkness of her confession. James opened the folder in front of him, flipping briefly through its pages. Passenger statements. A formal report from Captain Reynolds. A complaint filed directly by Mrs. Winslow. Carolyn flinched. She hadn't known Meredith had submitted a formal complaint. The weight of it settled like stone in her chest. James closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it. "The only reason you're sitting here," he said, "and not being immediately dismissed, is because Mrs. Winslow herself requested that you be given the chance to speak before a final decision is made." Caroline's head snapped up. "She requested that?" "Yes." She sat stunned, trying to understand. After everything, why would Meredith ask for this? Why offer her even the possibility of redemption? Through the glass doors, she could still see Meredith sitting quietly, unmoving, observant, entirely composed. And somehow, that steadiness sparked something unexpected inside Caroline. Not fear, not shame, but hope. "I know I deserve termination," Caroline said softly. Her voice shook, but she met James' eyes directly. "But I don't want my final act at this airline to be defined solely by my mistake." She drew herself up. "I want the chance to prove that I've learned from this, that I can do better." James raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose to do that?" Caroline hesitated. For once, she didn't have a rehearsed answer. "I don't know exactly," she admitted, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Silence fell over the room. For the first time, Caroline Whitmore didn't try to hide behind policy or image or rank. This time, she stood on vulnerability, on truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was something new. James studied her carefully, cold, cautious, but no longer unmoved. The other executives exchanged glances, unsure. Even one of the security officers shifted slightly, watching, listening, waiting to see if she truly understood the gravity of what she had done. Caroline swallowed hard, fighting the emotion rising in her throat. She had spent the entire flight believing the apology was enough. That serving Meredith quietly, suffering silent stares and whispered judgment, was penance, but it wasn't, because penance wasn't enough. Not if it didn't come with transformation. And this, now, was her moment to prove she was ready to start. Sitting beneath their steady, scrutinizing stares, Caroline finally understood the bitter truth. Apologizing wasn't enough. Saying she had learned a lesson meant nothing without proof. James Whitmore leaned forward, fingers lightly tapping the glossy surface of the conference table. His gaze was steady, commanding. "Miss Whitmore, do you fully grasp why this situation is so severe?" Caroline inhaled sharply. She had anticipated the question, rehearsed an answer in her mind, but now speaking the words aloud felt like swallowing glass. Her mind raced back to the moment at the boarding gate, the way she had dismissed Meredith Winslow without a second thought, how she hadn't even bothered to scan the boarding pass properly, because she had already decided that Meredith didn't belong. That was the truth, and it was ugly. She forced herself upright, shoulders square. "I told myself I was just following protocol," she said, voice tight. But that was a lie. James's brow arched slightly. His voice remained calm but precise. Then what were you doing? Carolyn exhaled slowly, her jaw clenched, then released. I was making a decision based on my own assumptions. The room went silent, but Caroline pressed on. I looked at Mrs. Winslow and I immediately assumed she didn't belong in first class. I didn't verify her ticket properly, and when she pushed back, I got frustrated. I touched her without reason. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. James's gaze held steady. You're acknowledging this wasn't just a mistake. It was driven by bias. The word stung. It burned in her chest like a brand. But she nodded. Yes. Saying it aloud hurt, deeply, but it also freed something inside her. Because for the first time, she wasn't just trying to save her job. She was finally facing the truth. The executives exchanged glances, this time not with scorn, but with quiet surprise. They hadn't expected this. James leaned back, folding his arms. And now, he asked evenly, what do you plan to do next? Carolyn blinked. I don't expect to keep my job, she said honestly, and I don't expect forgiveness. She took a breath. But if I'm allowed to stay, I want to help fix the very culture that made me feel justified in my actions. James remained silent, waiting. Caroline looked down, then back up. We're trained in policy, in procedure, but I never understood what it meant to serve every passenger equally. I thought I did. I was wrong. If I stay, she added, her voice firmer now, I want to help change that. A long silence followed. Then James gave a curt nod. Wait outside. Carolyn stood slowly. Her legs felt heavy, but her spine stayed straight. The security officers made no move to escort her this time. That small gesture wasn't lost on her. She stepped into the waiting area and saw her again. Meredith Winslow, poised, still, patient. Their eyes met. Caroline didn't flinch. She didn't hide. Meredith tilted her head slightly, her gaze calm but unblinking. They're discussing your future in there, she said, as if it were just a passing observation. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Caroline swallowed. I understand. Meredith studied her a moment longer. Do you? She asked softly. Caroline hesitated, then nodded. I think I finally do. For a long time, Meredith said nothing. Then she asked, what do you think they'll decide? Caroline looked toward the doors, then back. I don't know. She paused. I suppose, it depends on whether they believe I can change. Meredith tapped her fingers lightly on the ivory handle of her cane. And can you? Caroline's throat tightened, her hands twitched at her sides. I'd like to try. Meredith gave a soft hum, not a smile, not approval, just a quiet sound of acknowledgement. And somehow it meant more than any praise. Then Caroline found the courage to ask the question she feared most. Why did you ask them to give me a chance? Meredith's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Because I wanted to see what you'd do with it, she replied, whether you'd use it to defend yourself or to face the truth. Caroline felt something stir, deep and unsettling. A realization. This had never been about punishment. Meredith hadn't needed an apology. She didn't want revenge. She had offered Caroline a mirror, a chance to see herself, a chance to change. You could have demanded I be fired immediately, Caroline whispered. Meredith's gaze didn't waver. Yes, I could have. Then why didn't you? A pause, then Meredith answered, voice steady, quiet but cutting deep. Because I don't believe in letting people walk away from their mistakes without learning from them. The words landed like a weight across Caroline's chest, heavy, unshakable, but also transformative. Meredith hadn't been lenient. She had been exacting. She hadn't humiliated Caroline. She had held up a mirror and waited to see what Caroline would do with her reflection. And in that still, quiet moment, Carolyn Whitmore finally began to understand what accountability truly meant. They had been purposeful. Meredith Winslow hadn't needed an apology. She hadn't wanted punishment. What she truly sought was for Caroline to see herself clearly, and now she had. The conference room doors opened abruptly. Caroline turned sharply, her breath catching. James Whitmore stepped out, face unreadable. Behind him, the other executives filed out in silence, their posture straight, their eyes briefly flicking toward Meredith before landing squarely on Carolyn. Stephen Caldwell remained near the threshold, arms folded, gaze steady. He spoke first. "We've reached a decision." Carolyn braced herself, her fists clenched instinctively at her sides. James's voice was calm, deliberate. "Effective immediately, you are placed on probation." Carolyn blinked. Probation. She hadn't expected that. She had prepared for one of two outcomes, to either keep her position entirely or lose it on the spot. But this was something else entirely. A third path, a rare and difficult one. James continued, his tone firm but measured. "You will undergo extensive additional training, including leadership development and comprehensive anti-bias courses. Your performance will be reviewed closely over the next 6 months. If you fail to meet expectations, your employment will end immediately." The weight of his words settled over her like lead, but beneath it, beneath the sharp edge of accountability, there was also something else, an opportunity, not mercy, not absolution, but a chance to earn her place again. James's gaze sharpened. "Do you fully understand?" Carolyn straightened. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, but with conviction. He gave a single nod, then glanced toward Meredith. "Mrs. Winslow personally endorsed this outcome," he added. "Had she preferred termination, you wouldn't be standing here right now." Carolyn slowly turned. Meredith's gaze was steady, composed, unflinching. She hadn't fought to let Caroline stay. She had fought to make sure the staying meant something. Now the burden was Caroline's to carry. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with sincerity. Meredith gave a single, deliberate nod. "Make it meaningful," she said softly. Then with a light tap of her cane, she turned. And just like that, Meredith Winslow walked away, poised, unhurried, her presence as commanding in departure as it had been from the moment she stepped into that terminal. The rhythmic tapping of her cane echoed for a few beats, then faded into the din of the airport crowd. Caroline remained where she stood. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel resentment. What she felt was small, but not small in the way she had earlier when passengers stared, when her shame felt blinding. No, this was something else, a humbling. She had spent years believing she knew her job inside and out, believing she could read people at a glance, determine who deserved to be where. But she had been wrong, and Meredith Winslow had given her the chance to understand that. James's voice broke gently through her thoughts. "Report to training headquarters Monday morning. You'll receive further instructions." Carolyn nodded. Her voice was calm. "Yes, sir." James studied her for a final moment, then turned and left with the others. Carolyn remained behind. She exhaled slowly, unclenching her fists. She had not been forgiven. She had not been absolved. What she had been given was a test, a quiet, unyielding invitation to prove that she could grow. Around her, the airport continued its ceaseless rhythm, boarding calls, clattering wheels, voices rising and fading. But inside her, something had stilled. Carolyn Whitmore had been given a second chance. But she knew now redemption wasn't granted. It had to be earned. And that journey, the one inward, would be the hardest she had ever taken. If you connected with this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that reflect the impact of humility, change, and quiet strength. Thank you for watching.